Hello and welcome to the most in-depth summary video that you will ever see. It's going to be really long, I'm thinking well over an hour, so I'm going to include timestamps so that you can jump to all of the relevant parts, but I recommend that you watch everything anyway, because everything that I say in this video is probably going to be building off of other parts of the video. The next note I want to make is that I wrote down a long script that I'm going to be reading off of and that you can see in the video. One, because I am really bad at making videos without these elaborate scripts, and two, because I'm going to upload this script so that everyone will have their own free notes and their own version of the script in case they want to give a similar lecture to people that they are working with. The final note before I start is that I'm going to be talking pretty fast because I need to get through a little over 8,000 words, but YouTube does let you slow down the video if I'm going too fast or if you can't follow along. With that said, I'm going to jump right in. The first thing that I want to talk about for this summary is what is strategy and how exactly is strategy different from a line of offense. A line of offense is just any argument that independently validates the statement of fact in the resolution. For example, genetically modified foods increase crop yields, or economic globalization increased income inequality. When the resolution is proposing a policy that should be passed, you can also think of it as any desirable thing that happens in your world, which could also be avoiding an undesirable thing from the opponent's world. For example, abolishing capital gains tax creates equity bubbles, or banning private prisons decreases recidivism. Strategy, on the other hand, is a much more complicated and vague term, and it can apply on a lot of different levels of the debate. For example, all of the following are valid examples of strategy. 1. Speak really fast so they can't understand anything you say. 2. Focus on flow coverage in the rebuttal because our first speaker is bad. 3. Keep the debate centered on the moral hazard argument. And 4. Use the second contention as an internal link turn to their B's argument. Again, these are all valid examples of strategy, but the first one, speak really fast, is a rhetorical strategy. The second, focus on flow coverage, is a style strategy. And the third and fourth are both examples of a content strategy. Throughout the rest of the video, I am always going to be discussing strategy in the context of debate content, which for me I'm going to define to be about the arguments that you use and how you use these arguments on the flow to generate as much offense as you can. I came up with this definition of strategy that I'm going to be using on the video, and if you don't agree, that's okay because it's not particularly important, but it does help ground everything else that I'm going to be saying. And this is just a modified definition of strategy that I took from one of my courses at UW. I came up with debate strategy as, quote, the set of reinforcing choices that allows the team to establish an offense differential. Again, choices here are going to be choices regarding debate content, not debate style. Debate style strategy is an important component of winning rounds, but it's not what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the video. Reinforcing choices means that all of the choices need to be working together, or they need to be cohesive towards a single goal, rather than being a bunch of independent scattered choices that don't really flow well together. And then finally, when I say offense differential, this refers both to establishing your own offense and weighing your offense against the opponent's offense. I'm then going to go one step farther and say, if debate strategy is about establishing an offense differential, then what is the optimal strategy? Well, I would say the optimal strategy is the set of reinforcing choices that maximizes the efficiency of establishing an offense differential. For example, something like go for hunger, impact on contention 1, social cohesion, impact on contention 2, and then bury them in impact defense. Or go for the recession contention, use it to link turn their welfare argument, and then give link defense on their inequality contention. Or finally, go for the war scenario, briefly mention the impact defense, and then weigh hard on magnitude, right? All of these are examples of the set of choices that you are making regarding which arguments to go for that are establishing your offense and explaining why that offense is going to generate an offense differential. I want to go a little bit farther now and talk about how you should talk about strategy in practice. I think when you are discussing your debate strategy, whether it be with a coach or anyone outside of round reflecting on what happened, you should be referring to your strategy in decision language, which means instead of referring to your strategy as, quote, go for hunger, impact on contention 1, social cohesion, impact on contention 2, blah, 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 you would instead refer to your strategy as you would like to see the judge state it on the ballot, right? What I mean by that is that the judge votes affirmative if they have an offense differential, and they'll vote negative otherwise. But they're not going to put on the ballot something like go for recession contention, use it to link turn welfare, and then give link defense on inequality, because that is instead just the internal thought process that you are using while you come up with your strategy. They're instead going to put on the ballot something like this: the affirmative triggers a recession that also slashes welfare budgets. This isn't worth marginal decreases in income inequality. summary. Or they would put something like, hunger and social cohesion outweigh the extremely small risk of global nuclear war, right? They are taking the set of choices and explaining how exactly that established an offense differential that justified them voting for one team or the other team. When you are talking about strategy, and when I am talking about strategy in this video, it should be done through this sort of decision language because it makes it a lot more clear what exactly you were going for in the round. A note that I'm going to make right now is that you don't need to mention every single choice or every single argument when you are turning your set of choices into decision language. You just need to mention the implication of those arguments. For example, in this final example of strategy, we included the phrase briefly mention the impact defense, but here, when we turn it into decision language, we never actually mention impact defense, right? That phrase, briefly mention the impact defense, is instead incorporated into is more important than staying out of debt. What I mean by this is that you don't need to give the warrant for everything or the argument that you are going for, you just need to give the implication when you are stating it in decision language. In other words, strategy in practice is just a statement of how your offense justifies voting affirmative or voting negative, which means establishing how your offense shows that there is an offense differential. Later on in the video, I'm going to discuss how you should determine your strategy, how you can create these sort of thesis statements, and how you can utilize them in the summary. Cool. Now that we've talked about strategy, I want to talk about the goals for the summary speech. I think there are two. The first is to collapse, and the second is to set up your partner for the final focus. We're going to talk about collapsing first. Every debate round will begin with you having multiple lines of offense and multiple possible strategies to go for. I will say right now that if you are going into a debate round and you only have one possible strategy, then you are doing something wrong during your prep. It is definitely possible for you to win executing the exact same strategy every single round. Kevin and I did 6-0 Stanford and grab a bid doing that, but it's not a good idea because exactly what happened to us is that you're not going to be flexible if the opponents pick up on this summary, on this strategy, and are able to counter your strategy, right? You're not going to have a way to be more flexible and to go for a different strategy in the round. Much more importantly, it also will make you a one-dimensional debater because you might get very, very good at one type of strategy, but then the next topic comes out and there's no similar viable strategy, so you're going to be really bad at that topic. Okay, so if the round begins with multiple lines of offense and multiple strategies, the goal of the collapse and the goal of the summary is to pick the strategy and the lines of offense that you want to go for. Lines is plural because it's not going to be limited to one offensive argument, right? You can go for multiple contentions or multiple case turns. Strategy, however, is singular because you should always lock in your strategy by the summary, and you should always lock in only one strategy by the summary. The final focus is almost always going to follow this exact strategy, and I'm going to talk about the one exception a little bit later. Now this brings up the question, does this mean that there is no flexibility for the final focus? No, the final focus does retain flexibility because it retains different ways that you can execute a single strategy. For example, let's say you're going for this decision language strategy. Guaranteed recession outweighs minimal benefits from spending. Now let's imagine that at the end of the summary, you have great access to one line of offense, presumably guaranteed recession, and you have compelling defense against the opponent's case. Going into the final focus, there are multiple ways that you can execute this strategy. One, you could do so through extensive weighing, right? Focus on your line of offense that is clearly established and make it as big as possible. Or you could do it two, through extensive defense, focus more on the opponent's case and make their offense seem really, really small. Or three, you could do so through some combination of the two. But the important thing is that the final focus is always going to retain this sort of flexibility. If the opponents do a really good job on case, then you should probably spend more time on weighing because you're going to have a harder time establishing the defense. Whereas if the opponents do a really good job on weighing, you should probably spend more time on the link defense because that will sidestep the weighing question, right? The final focus is still going to retain flexibility, it's just going to be flexibility in terms of execution rather than flexibility in terms of strategy. The next question is, are there any exceptions to this idea that you should only go for one strategy in the summary? I will say no, there are not. What about if you want to go for two lines of offense plus defense on the opponents and then pick the better line of offense in final focus? Well, this is okay, because like I said before, multiple lines of offense is okay, it is multiple strategies that is not. When you say something like go for two lines of offense and then pick the better one in final focus, that is just a question of how you are executing the strategy in the final focus. Similarly, you might think, what if I want want to go for framing plus the corresponding impacts, but then also have some impacts under standard framing. Again, this is still just one strategy you're going for in the summary. Your decision to collapse to the framed impacts or to the standard impacts is just your method of executing that strategy in the final focus. I will say that there is no instance in which you should intentionally go for two strategies in the summary. Now, it's definitely possible for you to win doing this, even at the national level, because people are really, really bad at punishing a poor collapse, but you would win even harder if you didn't do this and if you only went for one strategy. It is, however, okay for you to go for a completely different strategy in the final focus if the opponents make a giant mistake. For example, if the opponents double turn themselves in the second summary, then it is okay for you to collapse on that double turn in your final focus. Similarly, if the opponents drop this mediocre link turn that you included in the summary but weren't really planning on going for in the final focus, then it is okay for you to collapse entirely on that link turn. The opponents made a mistake, you should take advantage of it instead of adhering to the strategy. However, you should always assume that the opponents are good even if they are not, which means you should never plan on swapping strategies going into the final focus, and thus you should never plan on including multiple strategies in the summary. The second goal of the summary is that you need to set up your partner for the final focus. When I say set up your partner for the final focus, I mean that you need good access to at least one offensive argument, plus you need minimal defense against the opponent's offense. Good access is just a term that I came up with to define reasonably compelling answers to turns, substantial link defense, and substantial impact defense. Now, when I say reasonably compelling, that does not mean that your arguments need to be slam dunk, but it does mean that you either need to be winning on the access question, or you need to be even on the access question for that line of offense. If you are losing access to that argument after your summary, then you are probably not going to get it back by the end of the round unless your second speaker is substantially better than the opponent's second speaker. A quick note here is that this does not mean you need to answer everything on case. You can completely ignore weak link defense and fake impact defense and still have good access to your argument. These are both terms that I sort of came up with. Weak link defense is fairly subjective, but it just means if you were to completely concede the argument, you would still access a large portion of your impact. You obviously don't need to answer that to have a good access, because you're still accessing a large portion of your impact by definition. Kind of circular, I know. And then fake impact defense is a term that I came up with to define anything that doesn't contest the size of the impact, but instead contests the implication. And this is something that I see PF debaters do all the time, right? There's a difference between saying something like, well, farmers only save $10 per month and not $15 per month, right? That is an example of actual impact defense because it is mitigating the size of the impact. Versus the opponent saying something like, farmers can't do anything with $15 per month. That second one is fake impact defense because it's not actually mitigating the size of the impact, it is only mitigating the implication of the impact. Obviously, you don't need to answer that because you can always make new implications in the final focus. That is never a new argument. You could also go one step farther and instead of getting good access, try and get great access, which I'm just going to define as compelling answers to all of the above. So instead of being even or winning on the argument, it is that you are noticeably winning on these arguments. If you are going in to the final focus and you have great access to these arguments, then you are probably going to win the round unless the opponents have a considerably better second speaker than you do. Again, you still don't need to answer the weak link defense and fake impact defense, but if you're going for great access, then you might as well, because it's going to be good for you to have anyway. Finally, you could also think of potentially having perfect access, which means you have an uncontested link, and there is no substantial defense on your impact. This is only ever going to happen if the opponents are significantly worse than you, and it is never going to happen on the national circuit, unless you're debating someone who shouldn't be competing on the national circuit, in like elims or something. Cool. The final thing I want to talk about is why am I focusing on access instead of focusing on impacts? I think that you should focus on access in the summary because the more time that you spend accessing the argument in the summary, the more time that there is for weighing in the final focus. And I think that the optimal position for the final focus is to be able to stand up and very, very quickly say there are X reasons why we have won this argument, and then very quickly reiterate the link work that was already done in the summary. For example, you could stand up and say something like, there are 2 reasons why we've won the cost cost argument. 1, the meta-analysis already accounts for the increase in pesticide costs. 2, patent reform by the end of the year will prevent all of the predatory lawsuits. That took about 8-10 seconds, and I've already established all of the link level arguments that I need in the final focus. That is only possible, however, if the summary spends a disproportionate amount of time focusing more on the access question and focusing on the link level. The other reason why I think you should focus on access and focus on the link level is because any sort of weighing done in the final focus is going to handle the dropped impact defense anyway, right? Dropped impact defense is really just a question of magnitude. It is a question of how big is this impact. Well, weighing is always going to answer that question because anytime that you weigh in the final focus, you are explaining why your impact is really big. Now, this also sometimes applies to weak link defense, because this link defense can be thought of as how much of the impact do they access? Well, weighing will sidestep that question, right? Because it doesn't matter how much of the impact you access if you are able to sufficiently weigh whatever impact you do have, right? That is why weighing is able to make up for not working on the impacts in summary. And that's why you should spend more time working on the link level or the access question in the summary. Cool. Now that we are 15 minutes into this video, I'm going to give a quick roadmap on everything else that I'm going to talk about in the video. Again, there's going to be 3 things. 1 is how do you determine the optimal strategy or optimal collapse. 2 is how do you efficiently access each line of offense. And 3 is when and how should you weigh in the summary. And I'm going to make 3 quick notes here before I go on. 1 is that weighing is the least important part of the video, and you'll note that a decent portion of that section is going to be dedicated to explaining why it is a luxury but not a necessity. 2 is that I've only ever seen a handful of PF debaters collapse properly, and I've seen literally 0 PF debaters access offense with maximum efficiency. Some of the California progressive kids are pretty close, but they're still not maximally efficient, which means those are 2 sections that I really, really highly recommend everyone watch no matter what. 3, and finally, is that if I had to rate these in order of importance, I would say the most important thing is collapsing, the second most important thing is efficiently accessing your offense, and the third most important thing is weighing. However, in reality, I've found that people do not know how to punish a bad collapse, even in the elims of things like the TOC, which is really, really frustrating to watch and really frustrating to judge. So in this case, if you are debating against opponents that do not know how to punish a poor collapse, then collapsing is no longer the most important thing, right? Because if you are inefficient in the summary, you're just going to lose the round, but if you are poorly collapsing in the summary, you can still win the round if the opponents do not know how to punish it. Whereas it is very easy, and everyone sort of by default punishes poorly efficiently accessing your offense just by default. That was sort of repetitive. Anyway, now I'm going to talk about collapsing. Okay, and the first thing to talk about on collapsing is argument selection. Which arguments do you decide to go for? And I think every camp and every coach pretty much gives similar advice, right? They say that you should collapse on the arguments that have low coverage by the opponents, have poor responses by the opponents, or have easy to weigh impacts. Occasionally, they will say this 4th thing, which is you should go for the arguments that best fit with your overall strategy. But I think this is really circular, because you are picking your strategy in the summary. So how could you say, pick your strategy based on what fits with your strategy, right? That makes no sense, so I'm not really going to address that too much. These other 3 sort of guidelines to collapsing, however, I think there are a couple problems with giving this advice to debaters. 1 is that while it's not incorrect, it is definitely incomplete. There are a lot of other components to argument selection that are left out, like cohesiveness, crossfire, weighing preferences, the type of opponent responses that were made, your experience and comfort with the strategy, which standing rebuttals you have on the opponent's case, etc. Much more importantly, however, I think that this advice gives the students the steps to the process without ever explaining the process itself, right? If the opponents just hear, or if the debaters that you're teaching just hear, oh, low coverage, poor responses, and easy to weigh impacts, they're never really going to understand the overall process that these steps are actually working towards. I think you should instead teach the debaters why are these the steps and why are these the decisions that you walk through before you collapse in the summary. The second issue that I have with this method of teaching is that it is absolutely laughable at teaching round vision, right? Round vision is not a checklist. It is not about, oh, what has low coverage, what has poor responses, what is easy to weigh impacts, let me pick everything out on the flow. It is instead about how all of the arguments fit together to establish the easiest possible route for you to access the ballot. And more importantly, everything is always going to interact with everything else, right? If you go for one contention, that's not just generating your own offense, but that's also modifying all of the decisions that you need to make on the opponent's case or on the rest of your case. So if you're just walking through this 1, 2, 3 checklist sequentially, you're never going to have a good picture of how the round is going and which arguments you should go for. If instructors or coaches claim that this process, right, this 1, 2, 3, is how they developed their round vision, they are wrong. That does not necessarily mean that they don't have round vision, right? I'm not going to say that all instructors are bad at this, but I'm instead going to say that's probably just something that they picked up through debating like 300 rounds over their career. And this specific process, asking what's low on coverage, what was answered poorly, and what's easy to weigh, contributed nothing towards that. In fact, I would say if this process did contribute anything to their round vision, it contributed negatively because it is the exact opposite of what you should be doing to develop round vision. So I'm going to give you a much better method, and I want you to, for now, forget about everything that you have been taught, right? These 3 things up here. Not because they're wrong, but because I'm going to bring them in a bit later, and I want everyone to start on a fresh slate, okay? Let's go back to the optimal strategy definition. We established earlier that the optimal strategy is going to be the set of choices that maximizes the efficiency of establishing an offense differential. So we want to develop a process based on this definition, and I'm going to hone in on 2 specific terms. The first is maximizes, and this is a little bit more difficult than people think. Whenever there is a limited time in a speech, every single argument that you go for is going to have a potential trade-off, right? There are positive ones, such as the more time that you spend on this argument, the more offense that you are going to generate. Similarly, the more time that you spend on one argument, maybe the less time that you need to spend on opponent arguments, especially if they use similar links or accessing similar impacts. There's also this negative trade-off, which is the more time that you spend on one argument, the less time that you have left for other arguments. The next term that I want to look at in this definition is efficiency, which I'm just going to define as the time that you are spending on the argument versus the amount of offense that you are either generating or mitigating. And this is where these 3 things up here come back into play, right? Totally lost my place. Here I am. Good opponent answers, or lots of opponent answers, are going to make you less efficient, so you might not want to spend as much time on these arguments. Similarly, if the argument is easy to weigh, or if it is a form of terminal defense, then you're going to be more efficient because you are either generating or mitigating a lot of offense. Okay, from these 2 terms, I want to establish the process that you should walk through in collapsing. And here's the overview to the process, right? You should go for the arguments that are most efficient after accounting for all the argument trade-offs. And I'm going to break this process down into 2 steps and then walk through it, okay? The first step is that whenever you are determining your collapse, you need to account for all of the trade-offs that every argument has. Some of these trade-offs are going to be really obvious, like more time on this argument means less time spent on this argument. But there are also more complicated ones that 99% of debaters ignore, and that's why I think most debaters are very, very bad at collapsing. Now, these harder trade-offs are primarily going to come in play when you're combining offense and unrelated defense. And here's an example, right? Let's say your second contention link turns the opponent's first contention. Then let's imagine that they had very compelling answers to your second contention, and you only had mediocre defense against their first contention. Well, now there's a very interesting trade-off, right? If you go for this second contention, you need to spend a lot more time answering their very compelling answers. Whereas if you go for your other contention, well, now you don't have a lot of game on their case because you only have mediocre defense against their first contention, and you can no longer leverage your second contention as a link turn. So those are the sorts of trade-offs that you need to be accounting for, and I'll walk through an activity that sort of helps to establish these trade-offs a little bit later. Right, so once you have accounted for all of these trade-offs, the next question is you need to determine which of the arguments are going to be most efficient. Now, there's no formula or hierarchy that I can give you for this, right? Unfortunately, it's going to be a subjective call. How much offense do you think you are generating or mitigating, and how much offense do you think you need, or how much time do you think you need to spend on the argument? However, I can give you a couple of hints, right? The first hint is that uncontested arguments are ultra efficient, right? That one's really obvious. If an argument is dropped, you do not need to spend much time gaining access to that line of offense or that form of defense. A slightly less obvious hint, however, is that it is always more efficient for you to go for your own contention as a link turn, as opposed to going for defense against the opponent's contention, right? That's sort of the example that I had up here. If your second contention link turns the opponent's, and you need to decide whether you want to go for that contention or go for defense against the opponent's, it is always going to be more efficient, not necessarily better with trade-offs, but it's always going to be more time efficient for you to go for your own contention and use it as a link term, right? And the reason why is because of the dynamics of the final focus, which means you don't need to spend as much time in summary because the final focus has leeway on weighing. So here's sort of what I mean as an example. If you're going for this pesticides argument and you're saying that pesticides link towards farmer profits, that is not an argument that you need to make in the summary because the final focus has leeway to stand up and give this obvious implication, which is something like pesticides are really expensive, so we obviously gain access to the profits offense. Which means in the summary, you do not need to spend very much time explaining the implication of the argument right there, so obviously there's less time invested to win the argument, which means you're going to be more efficient. The second reason why it's more efficient for you to go for these sort of case as link turn arguments is because they're generally going to be unanswered implications, right? When you read defense against the opponent's case, the opponents are going to answer these arguments, but they're not going to answer all of the implications to your contentions. No one's going to stand up and say, well, no, pesticides doesn't actually turn farmer profits, because those arguments are generally true, and also those arguments are generally implications that are not necessarily made on the flow as of the summary. So because these arguments are unanswered, they are effectively uncontested at that point, which means they are going to be more efficient. Cool. The next thing that you should know for efficiency is that link arguments are far more efficient than impact arguments, unless there's a huge differential in how well answered, right? If an impact argument is completely dropped, that's always going to be more efficient than the link argument, unless it's a very, very bad impact argument, right? And there's the obvious component of this, which is that a link argument will cut off all of the opponent's impact scenarios on that contention instead of just one. But there's also a less obvious aspect, which is it's always easier for you to answer impact arguments, and more importantly, the opponents can just ignore them in the summary and then answer them in the final focus. So it's always going to be less efficient for you to invest a ton of time on the impact arguments as opposed to spending a ton of time on the link arguments. Cool. Next thing to know, next hint, is that crossfire really, really magnifies efficiency. The judge is going to give you a ton of leeway on answering an argument quickly if it has already been thoroughly dismantled in CX. And I'm going to cover this on another video, but if you aren't using CX to set up the summary, then you are using and doing the second CX period completely wrong. That is pretty much its fundamental purpose. But anyway, if an argument has already been made very clear that it is a bad argument in CX, then you don't need to spend a lot of time re-explaining, reinventing the wheel in the summary. The judge is going to give you leeway on being very quick and very dismissive. The next hint is that it is more efficient for you to go and execute strategies that you have already done before. Now, everyone knows this, but everyone always underestimates how important of a factor this is. Your first time going for a strategy is going to be a lot less efficient because you do not have sort of all of the phrasing that you need to use, all of the transitions, all of the pre-written extensions that you would usually have. So if you've gone for one strategy, if you've executed one strategy in 20 of your last 30 rounds, you are probably going to be most efficient at executing that strategy again. Cool. Another hint, there's a lot of hints, is that arguments on your case are, in isolation, always going to be more efficient than arguments on the opponent's case. And I'll talk about this later when I get to signposting, but you always need to do more signposting on the opponent's case, whereas done properly, you can get through your case doing absolutely zero signposting. So, assuming everything else is equal, right, or assuming that both sort of sides of the flow have equal responses, both in quality and quantity, it's going to be more efficient for you to go for your own side of the flow as opposed to the opponent's side of the flow. The next hint is that there's diminishing returns. If you are winning an argument very hard, then it is harder for you to generate even more offense from the argument, which means you need to spend less time accessing that argument. Now, this does not mean that you should only go for losing arguments. It's just that you should be aware. If you are winning an argument very hard, then it's going to be kind of efficient because you can very quickly access that argument and then spend time on weighing, which is going to generate a disproportionate amount of offense relative to focusing on the access level. But that's sort of something that I'm going to talk about later when I talk about weighing. The next hint, and it's also the final hint, is cohesiveness. If your strategy is simple and easy to follow, then you have to spend less time explaining it to the judge. So this means you're going to be more efficient if you go for arguments that work well together, flow logically into each other, are grouped by theme, etc., right? That's going to be more efficient because you need to spend less time explaining it to the judge. So that is my process, and I'm going to give you a TLDR of this, okay? First is you should be viewing round division as a process, not a procedure. Do not think of it as independent steps. Instead, think of it as steps that contribute to this overall process, but do not constitute the process by themselves. So what is this process? This process to collapse is that you need to account for all time trade-offs, and then you need to go for the most efficient arguments. Now, most teams do a good job of, or an okay job of estimating efficiency, but do a very, very poor job of accounting for time trade-offs. But this sort of comes back to bite them, because if you're doing a poor job of estimating time trade-offs or argument trade-offs, then you're really not doing a good job of estimating efficiency, because you don't understand all of the offensive and defensive implications to the arguments that you are going for. The final thing to know about this is that efficiency is a product not only of the usual things that you are told, quality and quantity of coverage plus how easy the impact is to weigh, but also some things that might be new, right? The impact implications, if it is a contention that turns case, whether it is a link versus an impact argument, your use of crossfire, your experience and comfort with the strategy, if it's on your case versus their case, if you're winning or losing the argument already, and then whether the arguments are cohesive and whether there is a general theme. Okay, so that is the TLDR of my process. You want to account for all of the time trade-offs and then go for the most efficient arguments. I talked earlier about my first pet peeve, which is that people just explain argument selection as step 1, 2, 3. My second pet peeve is that no one ever explains how to get better at the process. If your camp just tells you, here is what round vision is, but they never actually give you a drill or an activity besides something like redos or a collective discussion on what was the best collapse or impact drills, then they are bad at teaching the summary, because they're never going to help you actually build and hone this process. I think that eventually you should reach a point where you are able to recognize all of these argument trade-offs pretty much automatically. That is the point that I am at after 4 years of competing in high school debate, 3 years of coaching and competing in college debate. But it does take a lot of practice for you to do this, right? Until you reach this point, you're going to need to be asking yourself, what defense do I need to include if I go for X offense? What defense do I not need to include if I go for X offense, etc. So you should be practicing really hard, because it's going to suck up a lot of your prep time to envision all of these trade-offs by hand, which is why the next portion of the video is the more valuable portion of the collapsing, because it's going to be an activity that will help you practice your round vision. The next thing that I want to note under this pet peeve is that it is very difficult to teach someone how to determine efficiency. I mentioned earlier, there's no formula or hierarchy. There's just a bunch of hints that I can give you that come as a result of my experience, my sort of automatic intuition, what I know from debating 300 rounds of public forum. Now, you might be thinking at this point in the video, well, Ryan, all that you said is go for the best time trade-offs, and then you gave a few hints, which is technically true, although I do think that the hints are a lot more valuable than you think. But the more important part at this point in the video is you should be recognizing that efficiency trade-offs are the core of summary collapsing. Then begin to view every round, all of your redos, and all of your drills from the lens, through the lens of this process that I have given you, instead of viewing the summary through the lens of, well, what was covered least, what was covered best, and what has the most impacts, right? If you view through the lens of this sort of efficiency and argument trade-off process, then you're going to do a better job of developing round vision as you work through your debate career, right? So you can take the practice activity that I give you, keep everything that I mentioned so far in mind, and walk through it, and eventually you're going to reach a point where you are able to automatically and intuitively recognize what is the most efficient collapse. So now let's walk through this activity, okay? The first step to this activity is that you should draw a map of the round as it stands before the summary speech, and I want you to include all pieces of offense for each side. Do not include defense, so don't include a decent chunk of the arguments that you made in rebuttal, and most importantly, you should include all turns on the originator's flow. So what I mean by that is if you have a case turn that you brought up in the rebuttal, you should include that on your side of this map, over on the same portion of the map as all of your other offensive arguments. Okay? Then I want you to connect all of the offense if it controls the link to opponent's offense, and you should do this for both sides. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit and you'll see what I mean by this. Here's an example of this map that I made. Agriculture collapse is one line of offense that controls the internal link to hunger. So I drew this black thing to connect my agriculture collapse offense to their hunger offense. Similarly, their environment offense turns my superweeds argument. So I drew this red line to indicate that their environment controls the internal link to one of my lines of offense. I did that for every argument on both sides of the flow. I've got to scroll up a little bit. Okay, you should note that not all of the connections are going to be bidirectional. For example, the superweeds argument turns farmer profits. I don't think I actually drew that, but super weeds does turn farmer profits. However, farmer profits is not going to turn super weeds. So there are a lot of instances on this map where there is only a black line or only a red line, and there are some instances where there is a black and red line. That is because some of these lines of offense are going to be bidirectional and some of them are not. Anyway, once you walk through this and you connect all of the offense in this manner, you are going to be able to very easily visualize all of the offense that you are generating from each argument, right? I can look at this map and I can say, okay, super weeds generates its own offense. It also turns the food price argument. It turns the hunger argument. It turns the environment argument. And it should turn some other stuff, but I don't think I completed the map. Similarly, from this map, you can look and see the opponent's offense, what they generate from each argument, right? You can look at the hunger argument, and you can see hunger only generates its own offense. You can look at environment, and you can see, well, environment is going to generate its own offense, but it's also going to generate offense off of super weeds. You can look at health. Health generates its own offense, but it also generates offense off of the econ argument, okay? I will say that the activity that I'm walking through, it looks a lot cleaner on paper. I'm just really bad at video editing, so I don't know how to include my paper drawing, and I had to just remake my drawing in Paint. Anyway, so now you have a map of the round, which is a little bit different than a flow. If you're looking at a flow, sure, you might have all these lines, but you also have a lot of other arguments that are written down. So I like this map because it is a more visual way for you to understand which of these arguments are generating which pieces of offense. Again, it looks a lot cleaner on paper than it does on this crudely drawn Paint. Anyway, the next step to this activity is I want you to visualize the strength of all defense, and you do not need to write the responses down, right? So don't write down the defense on the map. What I have drawn right here is sufficient. I just want you to think, well, I know that my herbicides contention, which is right here, had very strong answers from the opponents. I know that the shortage argument had very weak answers. Then I know I answered their yields contention poorly, I answered their herbicide contention poorly, and I answered their rice contention very well, okay? So you should be visualizing all of the offense, how the offense connects to everything else, and then the relative strength of all of the defense. Now what you can do is you can see all of the trade-offs that you get from going for each piece of offense. For example, if I want to go for this herbicide contention, I can see, well, if I go for herbicides, that's going to lock me out of going for the shortage contention because I'm probably not going to have enough time to go for all of my case. But at the same time, I see something else, right? If I go for the herbicides contention, I can see that I don't need to spend any time going for defense on their first contention because I'm controlling links to both of their lines of offense. Similarly, I don't need to spend any time going for defense on their second contention because I'm controlling both lines of offense that they're generating there. Then there's this other trade-off, right? Remember, I visualized that herbicides had very strong answers, which means if I do collapse on this contention, I'm going to spend less time on their first and their second contention, but I'm also going to have to spend a lot of time answering their very compelling arguments. So there's a substantial risk that maybe I just lose the line of offense. Then I should visualize the trade-offs that I get from going for this line of offense, right? The shortage contention. Well, if I go for the shortage contention, I'm probably going to be locked down of going for herbicides because, again, I can't go for everything on my case. But at the same time, if I go for the shortage contention, because they answered it very poorly, then I'm going to be able to get through it very quickly, and I'm going to have more time to go for the opponent's case. I'm going to have more time to go for defense. And then finally, if I do go for the shortage contention, I can very easily visualize that I need to spend a lot more time going for defense on their second contention, their herbicide contention. And the reason why is because this map indicates that my second contention does not control any of the offense on their second contention. Okay? So at this point, you're able to visualize all of the trade-offs. And I will say that for every line of offense, you can get 3 components of a trade-off. You can say that going for this argument is going to generate me a certain amount of offense, right? If I go for the shortage contention, I know my lines of offense, plus I know what parts of the opponent's case I turn. Then I know if I go for this, what do I save time on, right? Going for this contention is going to save me time on their first contention, for example. And then finally, if I go for this contention, what do I need to answer? Well, if I go for this contention, obviously I need to answer their second contention a lot more. You should visualize the trade-offs from going for every piece of offense, okay? That is how you walk through the first step of the process that I gave earlier. But then you need to walk through the second step, right? So what's the last portion of this activity, this drill? Well, that is where you visualize the efficiency of going for each line of offense. Okay, and this is a little complicated. I had to break it down, but I'm going to try and walk through it as line by line as I can. Okay, the first thing is very simple. You need to estimate how long does it take you to get good access to your line of offense. So if I scroll back up to this map, I just look at like this contention, and just from the arguments that they made on the flow, I need to estimate, well, it's probably going to take me, I don't know, 50 seconds, 60 seconds, 70 seconds for me to get access to that line of offense. If you want, instead of thinking how long do I need for good access, you can think how long do I need for great access, but that's just sort of your own preference, right? Do you want to be going for good access or great access? And I'll also say that you're going to have a much better estimate of how long does it take me to answer these arguments when you get to the next section of the video where I talk about how you can be way, way more efficient, okay? But the first step of efficiency is you need to look at your own offense and you need to estimate, is it going to take me 30 seconds, 40 seconds, 20 seconds? How long is it going to take me to access that piece of offense? Then you should walk through every single piece of defense that you need on the opponent's case. And I'm going to emphasize right now, remember that what piece of defense you need is going to depend on which line of offense you pick. Right? Up here, I will need defense on their second contention if I go for my second contention, but I will not need defense on their second contention if I go for their first contention. So with whatever collapse you are walking through at this point, I want you to pick every piece of defense that you need, and I want you to ask yourself two things. One, if this argument is conceded, how much of the opponent impact does it mitigate? Two, about how long is it going to take me to win this argument? And this is really, really simple, right? If it's a dropped piece of defense, then all you need to do is a pre-written extension. That's going to be really fast. If it's an argument that you're already winning, then all you need to do is probably one short sentence. If it's an argument that you're even on, you're probably going to need a longer sentence. And if it's an argument that you're losing on, you're probably going to need one or two sentences, right? But for every piece of defense that you need, just walk through and ask yourself, how much of the opponent impact does it mitigate if I absolutely win the argument, if it goes completely conceded? And two, how long does it take me to win this argument? Okay, so now what you have is the total amount of time that you need to invest. Here we determine the amount of time that you need to invest on your offense, and here we determine the amount of time that you need to invest on your opponent's defense, or on your defense on the opponent's case, right? So we've answered part of the efficiency. We know how much time did that take. Well, we also know at this point through the activity how much offense you access, because up here we walked through that part, right? We visualized all of the argument trade-offs and we connected all of the offense. So you know how much offense you access, and then you also know how much offense the opponents access because you walked through this part where you said how much impact does it mitigate if I win this piece of defense, right? So now you can ask yourself, how efficient was that? How much offense do I access, and how much offense does the opponent access, and how much time did that take me? This is a rough estimate of your efficiency for that collapse. Now, before I finish this activity, I'm going to answer, well, what if you determined that it took less than 2 minutes, right? What do I do with the rest of my time, or what do I do with the other arguments? And this is pretty simple. If you can fit an extra line of offense in, then you can include an extra line of offense, right? You can just go back up and say, well, now I also want to include this line of offense. Let's add up how much time that might take too. Or, if you can't fit an extra line of offense in, then the remaining time goes to weighing, and that does not really matter for efficiency in terms of this activity. That's something that you'll sort of cover later, because as I mentioned, this is always going to be a luxury, not a necessity, and you should always be focusing more on access. And then finally, if you just really like weighing in the summary, even if you can fit in more offense, you might choose to weigh more instead. Right? But anyway, for your given collapse, you're going to have a rough estimate of your efficiency, and you're going to have a map of all of the trade-offs. Cool. So that answers this question, what is the optimal collapse? From looking at the results of this activity, you can see what collapse is going to give me the best argument trade-offs and what is going to be the most efficient. You should run through this activity for each collapse that you are considering. So in my example, I would first run through that activity, visualizing all of the argument trade-offs if I go for this contention, right? This is my herbicides contention, and then I would ask myself, how long do I need to spend accessing this offense, and how long do I need to spend winning all of the defense that I've put on the opponent's case that I need to go for? That would be walking through the activity once. Then I would instead walk through it on the shortage contention. I would say, what offense am I generating? How long is it going to take me to access this offense, and how long is it going to take me to access all of the defense that I need on the opponent's case? Okay? That is the activity. I hope it made sense. I tried to include a map so that you can sort of follow along. I think it makes sense. If you have any questions regarding that activity, let me know. But if you walk through this activity a lot, it is going to build your round vision, because instead of focusing on step 1, step 2, step 3, it is instead teaching you how all of the arguments work together to create this web of trade-offs, this web of efficiency. I'll note that this activity is not fast. It takes probably 10 minutes at the very least, and most of it is going to be spent on this step where you're estimating efficiency, because for that you need to walk through every single piece of defense that you need to go for and ask yourself a couple questions on it. So yes, it's a long activity, but if you walk through it a lot, you're going to get a lot better at collapsing very, very quickly. Cool. So that's it for the argument selection section, but there's a lot more to the video. The next thing that I'm going to be discussing is how much offense should you go for in the summary. And there's two things I'm going to talk about here. First is one line of offense is fine. You can go for one line of offense in the summary. And I will note that one line of offense is different than one piece of offense, which is different than one impact, right? One line of offense can include multiple impacts, and it can also include the internal link to multiple opponent arguments. So one line of offense does not mean you only have one piece of offense in the round. But I will go a step farther, and I will say that even going for one piece of offense is okay, right? You can win a round in the summary going for only one impact. The only relevant thing, and this is what I'm going to repeat a lot, the only relevant factor determining what the ideal collapse is going to be argument trade-offs plus efficiency. As long as your trade-offs and your efficiency are ideal, then you should go for that collapse, whether it's one piece of offense or 20 pieces of offense. But I'll also state that 20 pieces of offense is just never going to be efficient, so that's never really going to be a scenario that you'll come up with. It is rare for one piece of offense or just one impact to be an optimal collapse, but there are plenty of times where one line of offense is optimal. For example, anytime that you're reading one contention that functions as a turn to the entire opponent's case, it's going to be ideal, I think, a majority of the time, for you to collapse on that argument alone in the summary. For example, crowding out equality on the free community college topic from my senior year, or the terrorism link turn on the NSA topic from my junior year, which was like 5-6 years ago, so I don't know if anyone ever debated those topics. Cool. On this one line of offense thing, I'm going to talk about a quick rant, which is all the time I see camp material and other coaches say something like, you can't go for one line of offense in the summary because it leaves no flexibility. This is bad, and if someone says this, I do not think that they have any experience working with other forms of debate, or if they do have other experience, they're probably not particularly good. And if they are particularly good at other forms of debate, well then they don't know how to apply that to public forum, right? This is something that really, really annoys me about how people teach the summary. I'm going to repeat right here that the only relevant factors are argument trade-offs plus efficiency, right? We came up with the optimal strategy, and we said that is just going to be what maximizes the efficiency of an offense differential after accounting for all argument trade-offs. So the only thing that is going to matter is how big is your offense differential, and what are the argument trade-offs and efficiency in establishing that. Okay, so this means if case turns look more efficient and have a better trade-off than going for your case, then just go for the case turns, right? Kick out of your case if you have to in the summary. And as experience, I did this all the time in public forum. 3 of my 6 bids were from going all in on one argument in the bid round. That was something that I loved because no one knew how to answer. It's also something that I did all the time in Parley, spending a literal 12-minute neg block spreading one case turn that they mishandled in the MG. Similarly, I've seen it all the time while I'm judging or coaching LD or policy. The neg block or the 2NR in policy will just collapse on one, or sometimes 2, but or generally 2 or 3, but sometimes one piece of offense that was mishandled in either the 2AC or the 1AR. It's a lot more common for the 2NR to collapse to one piece of offense, but I've also seen it in the neg block. And then in LD, it's very common for the 1NR to collapse on a single piece of offense that the opponents mishandled in the 1AR because there's such a large time trade-off, right? Now, the summary time trade-off is even harder than the 1AR in LD, and it's only slightly easier than the 1AR in Parley or policy. So you should take advantage of this by collapsing on undercovered arguments, or take advantage of it by putting yourself in a position where the opponents don't have these undercovered arguments. Cool. That's my rant. But here's my actual rationale, okay? The objection that most coaches give is that you lose flexibility if you only go for one piece of offense. But I say, who cares if you lose this flexibility when you've just won the round in the summary, right? If you are the second speaking summary and the opponent's dropped a case turn, then it is game over, assuming you execute it properly. There is literally 0 risk to going all in on this case turn because there is 0 need to cover anything else. Any time that you spend covering something else is wasted. You could be explaining the implication of the the case turn instead. Similarly, if you're the first speaking team and the opponents drop the case turn, then it's going to be easier for you to win off of that case turn than attempting to beat the 2-to-1 time trade-off, right? If you go all in on the case turn, then now the opponents pretty much have to go all in on the case turn in their summary, which means you've reset the time trade-off to a 1-to-1, whereas it previously was you attempting to beat the 2-to-1 going from the rebuttal to the first summary. Anyway, so that is why, even if you lose flexibility, it is still going to be better for you to go for whatever is most efficient, even if it is one piece or one line of offense. Now, I'm not saying that you should always collapse to one line of offense. I'm instead just saying, once again, that the only relevant factors are argument trade-offs plus efficiency. I personally like and prefer going for one line of offense, but there are plenty of rounds where we stomped the opponents going for 2 lines of offense, or 2 lines of offense plus case turns, which is what I'm going to talk about right now. Okay? What about 3 lines of offense? Is 3 lines of offense okay? As an overview for this, I'm going to say you do not have time to go for 3 lines of offense plus sufficient defense against the opponent's case plus an effective overview or thesis in 2 minutes. Additionally, you cannot do a good job on the warrant debate if you go for 3 lines of offense in 2 minutes. And if you think you can, you're wrong. Send me a video of you debating and I'll explain why you're not doing a good job on the warrant level. But case turns are a potential exception, right? There are 2 notes about case turns. One is that while case turns are technically a line of offense, they are much, much faster for you to establish access to than your own contention, right? It's definitely longer than a lot of people think, because you can't just re-explain the case turn. You also need a corresponding uniqueness argument, otherwise your case turn isn't actually offense, which is something I'll talk about in another video, right? But it's still going to be a lot faster than establishing access to the contention that the opponent spent 4 minutes on. The second thing to note about case turns is that case turns replace defense. You do not need defense if you can access the opponent's offense, right? It's pointless. If anything, it's detrimental because you're mitigating the amount of offense that you will now generate. Okay, so there's a conclusion that we can draw here, right? Obviously, like I said, you cannot go for 3 lines of offense plus sufficient defense against the opponent's case plus an effective overview or thesis. However, case turns can sometimes replace the sufficient defense. So this means while you should never go for 3 contentions in the summary, it is okay for you to go for 2 contentions plus a case turn, or 1 contention plus 2 case turns. One final note, though, is that I'm not going to recommend going for 2 contentions plus 2 or more case turns, even though it's kind of similar. You might think, right, why can I go for 2 contentions plus 2 pieces of defense, but not 2 contentions and 2 case turns if case turns and defense take the same amount of time? Well, I think that even if you can technically do this, right, even if you can fit that into 2 minutes, it is much more efficient for you to go for 1 contention and 2 case turns, or 2 contentions and 1 case turn, because that just gives you more time to explain the implication. You're still going to have a better time trade-off and efficiency if you only go for 1 contention, 2 case turns, or 2 contentions, 1 case turn. So again, you can definitely fit 2 contentions and 2 case turns into your summary, but it's not going to be as efficient as a collapse otherwise. And I will say real quick, I have spent 8 minutes spreading 1 case turn, right? So you will not run out of things to say if you go and spend a lot of time just talking about 1 case turn or talking about 1 contention. Cool. That's all I really have to say about how much you should go for. It's okay for you to go for 1 line of offense, and it's okay for you to go for 3 as long as those are case turns that are replacing defense. It is not okay for you to go for 3 lines of offense plus a whole bunch of defense. Cool. The final thing I want to talk about collapsing is the thesis. I've made another video on this, but I've gotten a lot better at teaching it and explaining it in the meantime, so I'm going to include it in this video. The thesis is how you can win pretty much every single round very quickly. I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about your strategy and practice, but I think that your strategy stated in decision language, right, how you would like the judge to summarize the round as of the beginning of the summary, is a thesis statement. And I think you should always explain this in the very, very beginning of the summary, right? So this is something we covered in the strategy section, but an example of a thesis statement is something like, hunger and social cohesion outweigh the extremely small risk of global nuclear war, or the negative inevitably results in a war with Russia, preventing millions of impending deaths is more important than staying out of debt. They can, however, be more complicated as long as they are still clear and coherent. For example, genetically modified foods create superweeds that destroy the agriculture system. Even if farmers can destroy these superweeds, the cost of doing so outweigh any benefits that they get from higher crop yields. That is a little bit more complicated, but it's still pretty clear. You're going for the superweeds offense, and you're saying that that outweighs anything that the opponents can generate from crop yields. Here's another example. Free community college tuition crowds out institutional aid for other costs, increasing the net amount students pay. Even if it doesn't, an influx of students destroys the quality of education and turns the opponent's case. That's a little bit more complicated, but still pretty clear. You are going for crowding out, and in addition to that, you're saying that quality is a case term to the opponent's offense. Right? So I mentioned earlier I'll talk about how to write one, and I'll do that section right now, right? How do you write a thesis statement? Well, it's essentially a 1 to 2 sentence summary of why you should win the round if it ended immediately after your summary. And remember, you win the round if there's an offense differential. So in other words, this is going to be a 1 to 2 sentence summary of your offense plus why your offense justifies the ballot through an offense differential. So let's look at the offense, right? That is where I said something like GMFs create superweeds. That's right here. Or free community college tuition crowds out institutional aid. The next step is why your offense justifies the ballot. That's something like the costs of doing so outweigh any benefits from higher crop yields. That's where I'm saying not only do I have offense, but here's why that offense is an offense differential. Or here, increasing the net amount students pay turns the opponent's case, right? If it's a case turn, obviously that's going to be an offense differential because now they have no offense. Or if it's a net amount, that's also going to be an offense differential. I will say, however, that the line is not always super clear. Something like destroys the agriculture system is technically just a statement of your offense, but presumably it also justifies the ballot because the impact is really, really big. Okay? The important thing about a thesis statement is that it needs to demonstrate an offense differential, which means it probably should include language along the lines of which outweighs or its variance, which turns case, net worse, net better, which isn't worth, which must come before, etc. Right? You should state your offense and then very quickly explain why your offense justifies an offense differential. The next note that I'm going to make about a thesis is that the thesis needs to summarize your collapse, right? Summarize means it's not going to include a ton of different pieces of offense, right? I'm never going to include more than 2 lines of offense in the summary, unless, like I mentioned before, one of them is a case turn. But you don't want to include a ton of different pieces of offense in your thesis statement, because if you're doing so, that indicates that your collapse is not a good collapse. Similarly, you should not be reiterating defense on the opponent's case. Like I mentioned at the very beginning of the video, you're not going to include in your thesis statement something like, Republicans won't veto the bill. You're instead going to say something like, which outweighs the small chance of a veto. You are giving the implications of your arguments. You are not giving every individual argument every single warrant, right? And I'm going to reiterate, it summarizes your collapse. It needs to come after you have determined your collapse for the summary, not before, because it is a statement that summarizes your strategy in decision language. If it's longer than like 10 or 15 seconds, it's bad. No exceptions. If it's remotely difficult to follow, it's bad. No exceptions. If it reiterates warrants, like I said up here, it's bad. No exceptions. Most importantly, if it is not in decision language, then it is bad. It is not a statement of your strategy, it is a statement of why you won the round as you would like to see the judge put on the ballot, okay? If the judge was putting just 1 or 2 sentences on the ballot to explain, here's the offense and here's why I think that justifies my ballot, that's all that you should be including in your thesis statement. And now I have a pretty lengthy section on why you should include a thesis statement. There are a bunch of reasons, so I'm just going to list them off. One is that judges really like voting for the easiest decision, and the easiest thing to do is just to repeat the thesis on the ballot RFD. You might be thinking, well, flow judges don't do that, right? They don't want the easy decision. They're going to go through and do work. No, they want the easy decision. And if you think, no, really, flow judges don't care about that. They want to go through and do the work. Again, no. They do not want to slog through the flow. They want the easiest possible decision, and the thesis statement gives them the easiest possible decision. The next reason why you should do a thesis is because it means that the judge does not need to piece together your strategy because they are hearing it directly from you, right? If the opponent doesn't do this, if they do not give a thesis statement and you do, then you look like the only team that has a coherent strategy that the judge is going to be following not only during the summary, but during, like, the grand CX and the final focus as well. The next reason why you should include a thesis is because it is a roadmap on steroids. The judge is going to have a much easier time following along when they already know the strategy that you are going for, which means you're going to need less signposting on your case and less transitioning because the judge can already predict where you are going on the flow. Next reason is because it forces the summary to commit to a single strategy, right? Which means it is the easiest way to put my entire really long video into practice. You're going to look like a giant doofus if you read a thesis statement and then you discuss a bunch of irrelevant arguments. So it sort of forces you to do what you should be doing in the summary, which is going for one or two pieces of offense and very quickly explaining why those justify the ballot. Cool. The next reason why you should include a thesis statement is because it maximizes argument efficiency, right? The thesis statement is an indicator of exactly which arguments are relevant, and this is a note especially for new debaters who have trouble going for too much in the summary. Once you have made the thesis statement, you can just ask yourself, does this prove the thesis? That is a clear signal that the argument either is or isn't relevant. If it does not prove the thesis, do not include it in the summary. If it does prove the thesis, then you need it in the summary. This also creates a really easy way for you to maximize word economy in redos because it tells you exactly what can be cut without losing any important arguments in the speech. Okay. This next one is by far the most important, and if there was only one reason why you should include the thesis, it is this. It is because the thesis is the best way for you to summarize the round. Okay? A quick note is that there is a difference between an implication of an argument and the impact of an argument. An impact is always going to be some terminal violence against some entity, while an implication is a reason why the argument or set of arguments were used, right? Why they matter. You might think, are those the same? And the answer is no. The impact of a link turn on nuclear war might be something like more people die, while the implication in the mind of a judge is something like neg accesses X offense, okay? That's the difference between an impact and an implication. I think the biggest mistake that people make on the national circuit is that they do not include the implication to their arguments. Then they get really, really mad when judges interpret arguments differently. For example, you think something is a link turn, and the judge does not think something is a link turn. Well, you never explain that it's a link turn, so the judge isn't going to understand that, especially if they don't have a lot of experience with debate. Anyway, the reason why this is relevant to the thesis is because the thesis is the implication, right? It is a statement of, okay, here are all of the arguments that I went for in the speech, now here is why they actually justify the ballot. It takes the other 1 minute and 50 seconds that are going on in the summary, and it explains to the judge why you think that justifies the ballot, right? The most important thing I can say is when I am judging, all that I want to know is why you think your summary won the round. I, as a judge, do not want to piece together your strategy and then think, is this what they were going for? Is this what they were going for? Right? Try and put that together for me, and it's going to make my decision a lot easier and a lot more likely to be in your favor. The final reason why you should include a thesis is because it helps your ethos. Thesis-level claims demonstrate that you know what is going on in the round and how the arguments are interacting. If the opponents ignore the thesis claims and do not give their own, then they are demonstrating that they don't understand why the arguments matter, right? It looks like they are being outmaneuvered. And this is especially true for lay judges, right? All the time, you're going to get RFDs like, well, the affirmative is the only team that gave me a clear reason why they won the round. The negative got caught up in the details without explaining why they won, right? How many times do you hear lay judges say something like, I want voters, and I want you to tell me why you won the round? Well, a thesis statement is essentially starting every single speech with a statement of why these arguments mean we won the round, right? The opponents didn't give that, so you are the one who's going to be much more likely to pick up the lay judge's vote. Cool. Now let's talk real quick about utilizing the thesis, and maybe eventually we can get to the second part of the video. Cool, let's talk about utilizing the thesis. I will say that the thesis goes at the very beginning of the summary and the final focus, but that's a separate video, and then the rest of the summary is dedicated to proving the thesis, so it essentially functions the same way as a thesis in any school essay that you write. Again, the thesis is a decision language statement of your collapse, so if the rest of the summary supports your thesis, then you are successfully collapsing. You might run into a scenario where you included something in the summary that does not support the thesis, and there are two options, right? One is that this does not need to be included in the summary, right? That might be an indicator that you are going for an argument that is not required for your collapse. Or it is also possibly an indication that your thesis is bad, right? If you included a huge link turn on the second contention and it's not in your thesis, then that probably means you wrote your thesis bad, right? The thesis is a summary of your offense and why your offense is enough to justify voting neg. So if that offense is important enough for you to go for in the summary, then it's probably important enough for you to include in the summary statement or in the thesis. The next thing I want to note real quick is that there's a difference between something supporting the thesis and something being in the thesis, right? I talked earlier, the thesis is not going to include impact defense. It's not going to say, well, this isn't likely, here's a reason why Republicans never veto the bill, right? But impact defense still supports the thesis. So I don't want you to go through your summary redo and be like, oh, my thesis doesn't mention this argument, so I shouldn't include it, right? It's a question of whether it supports the thesis, not whether it is in the thesis. Cool. The final thing, I'm actually not going to cover this right now, but it's just you should include a thesis in the final focus, but you should know that the thesis can change going into the final focus. All right, this next thing is the last section on collapsing. And that is how do you group arguments together. I don't think it's really important, right? Flow judges are really not going to care how you group your voters, and lay judges are just going to be happy that you said the word voters in the first place. My personal recommendation is that each line of offense, preferably one or two, will get its own voter. Then if you're in front of a lay judge, then just call your opponent's arguments a voter, even if they're not offensive. And if you're in front of a flow judge, who probably won't care because it doesn't really matter, then just introduce the opponent's arguments as their potential offense or their potential voters, right? So your own offense is a voter, and then if you're in front of a lay judge, the opponent's offense is also a voter. If you're in front of a flow judge, just call it like their potential offense. Again, remember that one line of offense can access multiple offensive impacts. So if your contention link turns two of their arguments, then that's one line of offense, but multiple pieces of offense. What about alternative strategies for grouping? The most common one that I see is something like their case, our case. I don't really like this, but this is actually what I did for my last 2 years of debate. It works fine as long as you still collapse. Just call the voters something like our case and then their case, but treat every actual argument the same way that I mentioned earlier in this video. Again, don't go for every argument, right? A lot of the time I see people do their case, our case, and then they think that that's an excuse to go for all three contentions plus defense against the opponent's case. Don't do that. The reason why I don't really like this strategy is, one, people tend to not collapse when they are doing this. Like I mentioned, they just go for everything for some reason. Two is it generally isn't going to fit well with a thesis, right? When you have this thesis level claim about how all of the arguments are interacting in the round, and you're not really conforming to that, you're just saying, here's our case, there's their case, you're not doing a very good job of conforming to your thesis. And then finally is, like I mentioned on the ethos issue, is that it gives a perception of not being in control. When you're saying like their case, our case, and then just going on the line by line, it sort of indicates to the judge that you do not understand how all of the arguments are actually functioning together. And then one last alternative strategy, way to group arguments, is what I call multiple ways to affirm or negate. And this sounds absolutely ridiculous, and it kind of is, but I found it works so well for lay judges that I wanted to include it in this video. And when I say multiple ways to affirm or negate, that would be something like, Judge, the first voter is superior evidence. The second voter is superior logic. The third voter is dropped arguments. Now this is ridiculous, but it works really, really well for lay judges, right? And the reason why is because lay judges really, really love putting on their ballot something like X team had better evidence, or Y team had better logic as their RFD. And those are the types of RFDs that debaters really, really hate. Well, you can preempt this. Just assert that you have the better evidence and the better logic, right? Conform to their sort of expectations, right? Design your entire summary around these terrible, terrible RFDs by preempting them, right? If the opponents don't contest it and explicitly say, like, no, we have the better evidence, we have the better logic, then the lay judge is probably just going to vote for you because it's easier and because you're the one who said, like, we have better logic. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I won a ton of lay judges against teams that were better than me by doing this sort of strategy. Cool. That is all that I have for collapsing. We are 66 minutes into this video, and I have the other two things to talk about. So instead of splitting the video up, I am just going to move on to accessing arguments efficiently. Now, the key point about this section is efficiency. I'm not going to teach you how to answer the opponent rebuttals, because this is the same exact method that you should be using when you're answering any argument, and I'm going to cover that in a rebuttal video. I'm instead going to focus on how you should access arguments and answer arguments in as little time as possible, which means extending your own arguments quickly and answering the opponent's rebuttals quickly. The first thing that I'm going to talk about under this is extensions. I think that for the summary, every individual piece of evidence should have a pre-written extension, and it should be really, really short, right? You should maximize the word economy of these extensions before the tournament. Something like, our Johnson evidence indicates genetic modification raises crop yields by 38%, or our Taylor evidence says U.S. policy has destroyed relations with Bahrain. right? These extensions should include the author and the claim, but they do not need to include the warrant. Now, some people will teach that it should include the warrant. I personally disagree, because I think all of the warrant debate is going to happen anyway after the extension, so just save it for there. But if you want to include it in the extension, you can, just that's not what I'm going to be talking about in this video. Anyway, this maximizes efficiency because you can extend your evidence by reading the pre-written extension and then no more and no less, right? Then you just get to move right on to the warrant level. So if there is debate going on the warrant level, then if there's no debate going on the warrant level, right, if they conceded the warrants in the evidence, then you could get to just extend them. You can be like, our Smith evidence indicates that the U.S. economy is heading into recession. There are 3 reasons, and then just introduce the warrants. If there is warrant debate, then just go right into the line by line. Be like, our Smith evidence indicates the U.S. economy is heading into recession. They say business confidence up, but blah, 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 right? So just extend the evidence and then jump into the warrant debate. I'll also say that to maximize efficiency, extensions should all be written in a way that allows you to combine them. You should be able to take 2 things like the Jones evidence and the Kirk evidence and put them together to say something like, inflated equity prices will push the U.S. economy into recession, only cutting spending solves. That's our Jones and Kirk evidence, right? I've just combined 2 tags, and now I've maximized my efficiency. I think that as a benchmark, you should have everything so efficient that you can extend all of the evidence in one contention in about 20 seconds. Generally, you're never going to need to do this because no one's going to concede an entire contention, right? But this 20-second figure is just a good number that I give to illustrate how short these extensions should be. Then, if you're a bit advanced, I think you should take it to the next level and give every warrant an additional extension, right? You should still include these extensions of the tag, but you should also give an extension for every single warrant, right? So let's imagine that you have the Smith evidence that says U.S. economy is headed into recession because equity prices are inflating, the yield curve is inverting, and the debt to GDP ratio is getting too high, right? You would have 3 extensions for that. 1, the rising debt to GDP ratio inevitably results in recession, that's Smith. 2, our Smith evidence indicates equity prices are inflating, blah, blah, blah. 3, the yield curve is inverting, which Smith finds will plunge the economy into recession, blah, 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 right? You have 3 independent extensions for each warrant. That way, you get to pick and choose the most efficient warrants for you to use in summary. Now, this is something that I usually coach when I'm working with kids in LD who have really, really long, like 3-minute long cards, or policy who have like 3-minute long K cards. But it should be valuable in PF when you're using long cards that have a lot of warrants too. Next thing that I'm going to mention on extensions is if you're frontlining, I would recommend that you organize all of your front lines under the relevant extensions. So here I have my extension for the Taylor evidence, then I would just have all of my front lines in my file. Again, I'm not going to teach you how to frontline because answering arguments in the summary is no different than answering arguments in the rebuttal, so that will be in the rebuttal video. Cool. This section is a lot shorter. The next thing that I want to talk about on efficiently accessing offense and how to be efficient in the summary is there is a difference between accessing an argument and answering all of the rebuttals. And this is the #1 cause of inefficiency that I see on the national circuit, which is teams spend too much time on the link level because they do not understand that they have already accessed the link. And I'm going to split this down into 2 different points and then walk through some examples, right? Point 1 is that if you win that something happens, it doesn't matter whether it logically should happen. So here's an example with net statistics, right? You have a clumper analysis, and it's a meta-analysis that finds farmer costs decreased 38%, right? Now your opponents read a bunch of reasons, they indict your study, and then they also read a bunch of things that say, well, no, here are reasons why GM crops are more expensive. You only need to answer this clumper indict. You do not need to even spend any time on these, right? Answering clumper is sufficient. You can completely ignore the other 3 answers because of the standard empirics double bind, right? It does not matter whether logically the prices should be net high or net low. It just matters what was empirically found. If GM crops actually are more expensive, like the opponents claim, then that is accounted for in the empirical study. If clumper doesn't account for them, then these costs don't actually occur in the real world, right? That is the standard empirics double bind. Anytime that you have an empirical analysis and the opponents read a ton of responses explaining why that shouldn't happen, you get to very quickly dismiss them by saying it does not matter whether it should happen. If those arguments were true in the real world, then they would have existed in the empirical analysis. The fact that they do not exist in this empirical analysis indicates that they do not exist in the real world, okay? Now you might say something like, obviously it's a net statistic, right? I know that, but you'd be surprised how often national circuit teams still make this mistake, right? And second is that even if it's not a net statistic, it can still apply if you know what sort of variables the study controls for. There are all sorts of times where we would read a study that might not be a net statistic, but the opponents would read responses that were already accounted for in our study. So we could very quickly dismiss them by being like, it does not matter, the study said that doesn't actually happen in the real world. You're giving this cool logical indite, but we're giving the empirical analysis. It's the value of empirics. Okay? The second point I want to make under this whole efficiency is that no one is really responsive enough, and you can exploit this and be more efficient. And I'm going to walk through a couple examples here. One is something like directionality, right? Let's say you have a piece of evidence that says if the Fed raises short-term interest rates 2 more times, the yield curve is going to invert. And the opponents read some responses, right? They say, well, the Fed isn't going to raise short-term rates again. They say that the yield curve is a function of inflation, and inflation is doing fine. And they say that debt is up and that prevents bond yield curve inversion, right? In this case, you only need to answer the first argument. You can ignore the other two because you are making a directionality claim. It does not matter whether inflation is fine or spending is up right now. It matters how it's going to be in the future. And because the opponents only read one directionality answer, that's all that you need to address. This sort of directionality question happens all of the time, especially with statements of fact, right? When a resolution is not a policy that is being passed, but instead a statement of fact, there's all the time people read arguments about how it's going to be in the future, and a team will respond with how it is right now. That does not matter. You get to dismiss those arguments super quickly in the summary because it is not a proper directionality claim. The next example for this not responsiveness is independent links. So let's say you have this piece of evidence that says GMF-related pesticide spraying causes bees to die. And the opponents say, like, well, GMFs use less land, so the bees get more. GMFs can feed bees. Bees aren't actually dying. And GMFs decrease overall pesticide use, right? From these 4 responses, you only need to answer this one. You can ignore the other 3 in the summary, right? The first and the second are irrelevant because we have an independent link, right? Pesticide collapse will pesticides will independently kill bees even if they have more land, even if they have food, right? Doesn't matter if they have land if they suffocate, doesn't matter if they have food if they're poisoned. This third argument is another example of directionality. The current state of bees does not matter, it's only the future state of bees that matters. The only thing that you need to answer is the fourth one, because that is an internal link term, okay? That also comes up all the time, especially when teams are reading multiple links in their contention, one of them goes unanswered, and then for some reason, they don't collapse entirely to that. They still answer the unneeded defense. Cool. The next thing, I'm not going to give an example, is you don't need to spend a lot of time answering unwarranted arguments, which I think is just 99% of National Circuit PF. People don't read warrants because they want to fit as much as they can in a 2-minute speech. You have an extremely small threshold for dismissing unwarranted arguments. And I will say that the opponent standing up and saying, according to X, that's not a warrant, right? If they do not read the warrant in the speech, then they are not giving you a warrant, which means you can just dismiss the argument, okay? You do not need to directly answer it, just group it and say no warrant, and then extend your own warrant. Now, 1 second, I'm going to grab water. If the opponents then come up and they introduce the warrant in the next speech, that is a new argument, and if the judge believes otherwise, then they're bad. You should probably strike them, right? If they read a claim in one speech and then the warrant in the next speech, that is a new argument. You do not need to have it answered yet. So if they bring up the warrant in the final focus, for example, that's illegitimate. If they bring up the warrant in the second summary, then you get golden answers in the first final focus. The final thing to talk about under this is, does this mean that you can completely ignore the argument? No, I might have gone a little overboard when I've said things like, you don't even need to answer, you can ignore the other 3. You should still sort of address them, but you should address them through comparative analysis. So what I mean by that is, let's go back to this GMF pesticide argument, right? Where you're saying that spraying kills the bees, and they say they get more land, they get more food, they aren't actually dying, and the link turn on pesticide use. Right? Here's how you can handle this very, very, very efficiently, right? Presumably, if this is 4 responses, they spent like a minute reading these responses. Or they didn't read the warrants, one of those 2. You can handle this by just standing up and being like, our Miller evidence indicates that even if bees are doing fine now, pesticide use from GMFs will kill all of them. Surprise, pesticides will kill them even if they get more land or food. Right? Right there, I've answered those 3 very, very quickly because all I've done is some brief comparative analysis, right? I've explained that mine is directional and theirs is not. And then I've explained that these are not responsive because I have an independent argument, right? Then you can go on to the line by line and be like, they say pesticide use falls, but that's not true. Here's my warrant for why. Okay, at that point, it doesn't matter how well they warranted arguments 1 through 3. That first bullet that I gave here is going to answer all of them in about 9 seconds, right? That is how you maximize efficiency. Recognize what is unwarranted, recognize what is not directional, recognize what is an independent link, recognize what is not an empiric, and just dismiss those arguments very, very quickly. You're going to be like 30 times more efficient in the summary. So how can you practice recognizing this? One is you can take an old flow and then go through every single opponent answer on your case and just say, like, what if I were to ignore this argument in front of a judge who does not give the opponent's free implications? What I mean by that is a perfect judge, if you were to concede this bees aren't dying yet, the judge isn't going to care. They're not going to give any offense to the opponents because that is not an actual argument that has an implication, right? They're reading something that is completely irrelevant. You can concede that in front of a perfect judge. You could concede that argument in front of me, and I'm not going to do anything about it. But anyway, just walk through something like, what happens if I ignore this argument in front of a judge who won't really ding me just for dropping an argument, right? And you'll find that a decent portion of the opponent answers don't actually need to be answered directly. So do that a bunch, and you'll get used to it very quickly. The other thing is you can take an old flow, and you can mark every opponent response that did not have a warrant. Then practice the fastest way of grouping and dismissing these unwarranted arguments. And I will say, you might think, well, this doesn't happen at the national level. No, I think it's worse on the national level. I really do. The elite national level debaters who go really fast are even worse at this, right? There's a time where I'm not going to name a name, but someone linked a video of a rebuttal speaker, and they were like, oh my god, this is the fastest rebuttal that I've ever seen. Look at how many arguments they're getting through. And I'm like, they're not giving any warrants. They're just saying, according to X, this isn't actually true, right? If you think that's not true, link me a video, and I'm going to tear apart that rebuttal from not having any warrants. Cool. Some miscellaneous notes on access is you always need to answer a turn on your case no matter what, even if you're not going for the argument, otherwise you're giving the opponents free offense. 2 is never answer defense on an argument that you aren't going for. I see even national level debaters do this, right? If you're not going to go for your second contention, you don't need to answer any defense on that contention. If you're not going for your second link, you're only going for your first link, then you don't need to answer the defense on that link, right? That will save you some time. Finally, is this whole thing indicates that there's value to having independent links, right? If you have multiple independent links for each line of offense, then generally one of them is going to get undercovered, so you can just answer any turns they read and then collapse on that one link, and you're going to be way, way ahead on efficiency. The next thing to talk about on efficiency is speaking. And I'm going to give one example for the rest of this section. Let's imagine you have this pesticide argument where you're like, genetically modified foods decreases pesticide use because, crops are more resistant, so you don't need to spray them as much. And there's this farmer's impact and environment impact. It's not really important that you know that, just I want an example. And let's say the opponents give 3 responses. They say, 1, your study is bad. 2, farmers are dumb, they're going to spray a ton of pesticides anyway. And 3, super weeds are going to require more herbicides, so the net impact is bad. Okay. When I talk about efficiency in speaking, I think there are 3 levels. One is what a lot of novices do. They will restate most of the opponent's argument and then attempt to answer it, right? They'll say something like, our opponents say that super weeds will turn our contention because you need to spray them more and that will cause more pesticide use, but, and then they start answering it, right? That's really, really bad because you've spent more than half of your time just re-explaining what the opponent's already said. A lot of open debaters get a little bit better, where they move to the they say, we say format, right? They say prefer their study, but we say prefer our study. Or they say farmers spray anyway, but we say they don't. They say GMFs cause super weeds, but we say they don't. Okay? That's where I think probably 99% of people watching this video are going to be at right now. Just because, like I said, I've never seen anyone actually in public forum do the next level for the entire speech. But the next level is what you should be doing. It is the best sort of efficiency, which is really important in the summary, and that is to move from the they say, we say, to yes, no, which is where you cut the they say section. So instead of saying they say prefer their study, we say prefer our evidence, you just stand up and you say prefer our evidence. Right? Instead of saying, they say farmers spray anyway, we say farmers won't because they care, just stand up and say, like, yes, farmers care. Or, they say super weeds, we say blah, you just stand up and you're like, no super weeds. Okay? So, as an example for that, if I were to do that sort of efficiency for all three of these responses, it would just be me standing up and extending the contention, and then when I get to the line by line, I'd be like, prefer our evidence over the Union of Concerned Scientists. That's a biased source that really sucks. Yes, farmers care. They're not going to spend money on pesticides because they want to make profits, and no super weeds. And then I don't know the warrant off the top of my head, but something like that, right? That way, you're being way, way more efficient because you're not doing the they say, right? It's the next level of efficiency that people just do not get to for some reason. You might be thinking, what about signposting? You're okay doing the yes-no as long as you do it right. When you say something like farmers care or super weeds, that is enough signposting because that is a keyword that will tell the judge which argument you are responding to. You just need to make sure that you use keywords that match what the opponents say. So opponent said farmers don't care, so I'm going to say yes, farmers care. Opponent said super weeds, so I'm going to say super weeds. It would not be enough for you to instead say something like, farmers have profit incentives that will cause them to limit spraying, without saying the yes, farmers care, right? Because you haven't given the keyword, so the judge isn't going to know where you're going. Similar thing here, you can't just go right into, there's going to be decreased herbicide use from GMFs, which is going to decrease the prevalence of super weeds. There's the same issue, right? This keyword super weeds does not come until the very end, so you have not given the judge enough time. Whereas when you say yes, super weeds at the beginning, they know exactly where you are on the flow. That is sufficient signposting. This is what most people do on like national level policy debate rounds, and I'm not sure why it hasn't trickled down into public forum yet, because it's still just as lay, right? Lay judges do not require you to say they say and then restate the opponent's argument, but it's way, way more efficient. So I think PF debaters should start doing that. Okay. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that literally zero PF debaters access offense with maximum efficiency, and I really, really meant that. I have never seen a single summary that does both of these. Dismiss all rebuttals that do not impede access to your line of offense. That's the earlier thing I was talking about. And 2, use yes-no phrasing for the entirety of the summary. Okay, I've actually never even seen this part happen alone. I've never seen anyone use yes-no phrasing for the entirety of the summary. I saw a really progressive California debater, I think it was someone from Mission, who I thought got really, really close, and then they slipped into restating more of the opponent's argument near the end of their summary speech. But anyway, so no one is maximally efficient, so if you're able to do these two things very well, then you're going to be more efficient than even the most efficient debaters on the national circuit right now, so you're going to be in an advantage. Cool. Now that we are almost 90 minutes into this video, I can get to the final section, which is on weighing. Cool. This one is not that long. There's only 4 pages left. On the weighing, first thing I'm going to note is that weighing in the summary is a luxury, not a necessity. A lot of camp instructors say that weighing must begin in the summary, and no, it doesn't. It definitely should, but it doesn't have to, okay? It's a luxury, not a necessity. It's a good idea if you have time, especially if you're collapsing to one line of offense. Especially if you're collapsing to one line of offense, then you definitely have time to weigh, so there's no excuse there. But I will say, it is possible for you to win a national championship without doing any summary weighing at all. And if you don't believe me, then just go watch any national championship round, because I'd say it happens the majority of the time, at least in the ones that I have seen. I need more water, because I've been talking for like 90 minutes. 1 second. Cool. So what is my rationale, right? Why do I think that it's a luxury but not a necessity? Well, first is the obvious. Weighing is irrelevant if you don't win the argument, which means priority 1 is always going to be establishing good access to the line of offense, and you should never ever sacrifice anything along the lines of access to fit in weighing. The second reason is a little bit less obvious, which is that weighing is never a new argument, but new link arguments are too new for the final focus, right? A quick note before I go on is that turns case arguments are not technically weighing, so you cannot save those for the final focus, okay? I'm not saying wait until the final focus and be like, oh, we turn the entire opponent's case. No, you can't do that. However, things like magnitude, probability, time frame, the occasional reversibility scope, those are weighing, and those are not too new for you to mention in the final focus. You can wait until the very last second in the final focus and say, also, we outweigh on time frame because we happen first, and that is not a new argument, okay? Now, some judges or debaters might be watching this video and think, no, that's way too new. You can't wait until the final focus to mention magnitude, otherwise the opponents can't respond. And I'm just going to say that you are the type of judge that we like to laugh at in other debate events, so please comment on the video so that I can laugh at you. You might ask yourself then, well, should I include it for those judges, right? If there are judges that think that you need to start weighing in the summary or else it's brand new, should I include it just for those judges? And I'll say, no, only include it if it doesn't sacrifice gaining access to that line of offense, right? What I mentioned earlier. Include it if you have time, but even if the judge requires it as a necessity, it is still more important for you to have access to the argument. And the other note is you should strike any judge who says that weighing in the final focus is new, because it's not. It's like fundamentally not new, and any judge who says that has given you an indication that they do not understand debate at its core, that they have maybe experience doing public forum, but that they're not familiar with like what a rebuttal speech is in other debate events, or what a rebuttal speech really is at its core. Anyway, so those are the types of judges that I'd strike. Maybe an overreaction, but like I really don't like judges who say that weighing is new in the final focus. It's not. All right, the next less obvious part of my rationale is that the final focus is the final collapse, right? That is where you make your final decision for what piece of offense do you want to go for. So what happens if you weigh a line of offense in the summary and then all of a sudden you don't go for it in the final focus, right? You've wasted all of that time. Similarly, what happens if you weigh a line of offense in the summary and then the opponents win a link term in the second summary, right? It's zero risk for you to do your weighing in the final focus, while it's always going to be at least positive risk for you to weigh in the summary, unless you're collapsing to one piece of offense in the summary, in which case you have to do it anyway. But just because the final focus is the final collapse, it's okay for you to save weighing for the final collapse, because obviously you can't do optimal weighing until you know the piece of offense that you are 100% going for in the final focus. Now, a quick note here under my rationale is I still think you should weigh in the summary. These are not reasons why you should prioritize access, these are reasons why you should prioritize access over weighing, but they're not reasons why you should ignore weighing. The reason why I include this section is because all the time I will judge kids who start weighing an argument when they have not yet established good access to the next line of offense that they are going for. Okay, that's annoying. Go for the line of access first, and then you should talk about weighing if you have additional time. Cool. Now I'm going to talk briefly about how to weigh, but I'm going to make a different video on this, or I'm going to include it in my final focus video later, so I don't want to reiterate the standards of weighing, because otherwise there's just nothing else to include in that final focus video. But I am going to talk about a couple things that I think are important to know in the summary and are important to know right now. First, as a quick note, people tend to think of weighing as magnitude, probability, time frame, occasionally scope, reversibility, or other mechanisms they've been taught that probably are, just repeats of magnitude. But that's not really what weighing is. Weighing is about comparing the amount of offense on your side to the amount of offense on the opponent's side, which means by default, all defense is a form of weighing, right? Impact defense is obviously weighing. I don't think anyone would ever contest that. If you are mitigating the size of their impact, then you are mitigating the magnitude, maybe mitigating the time frame or probability, which means that is going to be a form of weighing. However, link defense is also a form of weighing because link defense indicts magnitude and probability. Similarly, uniqueness arguments indicate indict time frame and probability. So all defense is a form of weighing. Now I'm going to take it back to earlier in the round when I said something like the biggest mistake on the national circuit is not including implications, right? They get mad at judges when they interpret arguments different because they never explained how the judge should interpret this argument. Well, judges tend to interpret defense as a do they win this argument, yes or no, right? In other words, it's either terminal defense or not. If you want the judge to have a different implication or a different interpretation of your defense, you need to make it very, very clear. So how do I recommend you do this? Refer to your defense on the relevant section of weighing, right? When you are going for your defense, do not just say, like, here's my piece of defense, so they lose this contention. You need to explain, here's my piece of defense. This also means we outweigh on time frame. Or when you're on time frame, say this outweighs on time frame, remember our uniqueness answer, which indicates that this hasn't triggered anything for at least 2 years. Or this also outweighs on magnitude. Remember our link defense, right? It's not going to resolve 20% of the population, something like that, right? This way, you are able to maximize your efficiency by integrating all of your defense into your impact weighing. And much more importantly, it means that you are able to give an implication or interpretation to all of your defense, so the judge doesn't just dismiss the defense because they don't consider it to be terminal. That's something that I see a lot of people complain about, is that a judge will just dismiss a piece of defense because it's not terminal, right? Obviously, not every piece of defense is terminal. There's that additional implication. You just need to include that implication, right? The implication of defense is always an indite of the size, probability, time frame, any other aspect of their impact. Cool. There are three other things I want to briefly rant about on weighing. Next is, I think people should evaluate time frame more. And there's a really important aspect to time frame that I don't see utilized in public forum, which is once an impact is tripped, people will change how they act. For example, if the economy collapses before the election might swing. If a recession occurs before the equity bubble pops, then a bubble probably goes away, right? There is value in having the first impact, and here's the reason why. Their link is predicated on what will happen when we change from the status quo, or we keep the status quo. But once an impact has happened, the status quo changes, right? So now they need to demonstrate how their link still occurs in this new mystical future, okay? In other words, the fact that we might go to war now does not mean that we will go to war once we hit recession. Or the fact that we are headed into recession now does not mean we will go into recession once the politics scenario is tripped. So there is value in having the first impact because usually it can prevent other impacts from happening in the first place, right? People tend to just weigh time frame along the lines of, well, ours happens first, so it's more important, right? Well, it doesn't really matter if something happens first if it doesn't change anything else. So you need to utilize time frame a little bit better in public forum rounds. Cool. The next thing on weighing that I want to talk about is using uniqueness to your advantage in policy topics, okay? Every single contention needs to have a uniqueness argument that illustrates whether the status quo is good or bad. The AF always argues that the status quo results in something bad, and then link arguments are an indication of how the affirmative will fix this. Well, the neg wants the opposite. The neg argues that the status quo results in something good, and then the link arguments are why the affirmative turns this into something bad, okay? That's always something you should include on a policy topic. Or what I mean by policy topic is a topic where there is a policy proposal at hand. Statement of fact do not always need uniqueness. I know that's a controversial claim, but unfortunately it is true. So I don't like those types of resolutions. Anyway, if the negative concedes uniqueness evidence, then the affirmative now has control over what the negative is defending. And I'm going to give you an example that I coached on the capital gains topic, okay? I coached a case that included multiple pieces of evidence saying status quo causes yield curve inversion, and yield curve inversion always causes recession. Now, the negative defends the status quo, which means if they are not able to contest this uniqueness claim, then the negative is essentially defending recession, right? If we have a guarantee that the status quo results in recession, and the negative is defending the status quo because they can't bring up a counterplan, then the negative is by default defending recession, okay? This controls impact uniqueness, right? If the negative concedes this argument, then every other neg impact that results in recession becomes non-unique, right? Let's say the negative has an equity bubble argument, and they say an equity bubble will plunge us into recession. Well, when you have uniqueness handled properly, you get to stand up and say something like, sure, abolishing capital gains tax has a chance of popping an equity bubble and causing recession, but that recession impact is non-unique because you conceded that the status quo also causes recession, and you're defending the status quo, right? That is the value of having a uniqueness argument. Now, people who are familiar with uniqueness or who are coaching other events might be watching this video and think, why are you talking about this on weighing? Well, I think that uniqueness has two really important implications for weighing. One is magnitude, okay? In every other debate event, linear advantages and disadvantages aren't considered offense. In PF, they are, but they have significantly less magnitude, okay? So what I mean by this is negative in this hypothetical example with the yield curve argument could still argue your recession is worse than our recession. They could say, like, it's the equity bubble recession is going to be way worse than the recession that comes in the status quo. But now, they're only generating offense from the recession differential, right, rather than the entire recession. Their impact is significantly smaller. Instead of saying our impact is recession, they're saying our impact is a slightly worse recession than what happens in the status quo. So you can use this sort of uniqueness question to indite the magnitude of their impacts. Cool. The next reason why it's really important for weighing is that you get try or die rhetoric. Now, try or die is when the affirmative gets to stand up and say something like, negative guarantees X impact because they defend the status quo. The affirmative at least has a risk of avoiding this fate because we try something, right? If the opponents were to concede that the status quo inevitably results in recession, this would translate to something like, the negative has a 0% chance of avoiding recession, then you should vote affirmative by default because we at least have some chance of avoiding recession, right? We do something different. That sort of try or die rhetoric is very powerful, and it's especially powerful when you are dealing with very, very large impacts like mass recession or mass war. Cool. I'm going to make another video on uniqueness one day because PF needs it, but a random note real quick that doesn't have to do with weighing, that I just think everyone should know, because I mentioned it earlier in the video, is if they concede uniqueness, then all link turns are defensive, they are no longer offensive, right? Because if they concede the uniqueness argument, this translates to the affirmative causes the same thing that happens in the status quo, right? Sometimes this will translate into, well, the affirmative makes the status quo slightly worse, but if the uniqueness evidence is good, that's still not going to be offense. But all of that's something that I'm going to talk about later in the video. A final note real quick is that I'm using language like affirmative and negative in this, but because of the way that PF resolutions are written, this can swap, right? The negative can go for try or die rhetoric. I mean, they can go for try or die rhetoric multiple times, but they can always go for try or die rhetoric when the resolution is sort of inverted like it commonly is in public forum. All right, the last thing I want to talk about on rants about weighing is comparative analysis. I think that teams need to stop, especially in the summary, weighing just by saying, like, our impact has high magnitude, high probability, fast time frame. Instead, you need to explain why it has a larger magnitude, higher probability, faster time frame, right? Does that sound simple? It is, yet national level debaters still forget this comparative part, right? They just say our impact is really big. They forget to say our impact is bigger than the opponent's, here's why. And also, they tend to not include the warrant, right? Even when someone does comparative analysis, they're like, we have a faster time frame than the opponents because this. They don't explain why they have faster time frame than the opponents. So I'm going to walk you through 3 levels of weighing, right? One is bad, just to say we outweigh on probability because our impact has a 100% chance of occurring. There is no comparative analysis going on here. You're just saying that our impact is really good. Slightly better is to say we outweigh on probability, our impact has a 100% chance of occurring, while their scenario has conceded impact defense. That's better, but it doesn't mention the warrant, right? It's still comparative analysis, but it doesn't mention why the comparative analysis is true. Then finally would be good impact weighing, something like we outweigh on probability, yield curve inversion has a 100% success rate in predicting recessions, while speculation has only popped equity bubbles a couple times. That's an example of good comparative weighing because it's comparative and it also includes the warrants. Next section, and I promise we're almost done. See, there's just a page and a half left, is how much should you weigh and when should you weigh? First note is that you're going to be limited by time, right? Obviously, you can only fill how much time you have remaining after establishing access to your lines of offense. I personally would prefer weighing in the summary over an additional line of offense, but very flow-oriented debaters might prefer the additional line of offense. I know for my last 2 years of debate, we did 0 weighing in the summary. We also just did a different sort of style of debate, but it worked just fine for us. So it's possible, it's just a question of preference. But no matter what, you're going to be limited by time. Always establish access to your offense first. The next thing to note is you should not weigh an argument in summary when you aren't very confident in your answers to a standing link turn, right? Don't weigh an impact and then have the opponent stand up and then win all of your impact, right? If you have not slayed the link turn, don't weigh because then the opponents are just going to get access to that offense, and then you've wasted all your time. Next thing to note is you should not weigh to boost a bad argument, right? Some people have this thought process where they're like, this argument isn't very good, so I'm going to spend a ton of time weighing it. Well, this is ridiculous. You should just spend more time weighing the good arguments because they're more efficient. Next thing I'm going to say is a lot of people think that they shouldn't weigh, like they shouldn't do too much weighing because they can't go for high magnitude and high probability. Now, this is not true at all. There's nothing wrong with going for high magnitude and high probability. Obviously, there's you can't go too extreme with this. You won't win that nuclear war is higher in magnitude and probability than structural violence. But there are tons of situations like recession. You can go for a recession as higher in magnitude and probability than income inequality. Okay, so it is okay for you to go for sort of all aspects. Okay, so now I want to answer the question, how much should you weigh? I think that if you have time, okay, only if you have time, do not sacrifice access, but if you have time, the ideal amount of weighing is for you to have comparative analysis on magnitude, probability, and time frame, and at least one argument controlling the opponent link. For example, right, we outweigh on probability, here's the warrant, we outweigh on magnitude, here's the warrant, we outweigh on time frame, here's the warrant, and then finally recession terms case, here's the warrant for that. Okay? This last one isn't, I mean, in a way it is weighing, but at the same time it's not like one of the standard mechanisms of weighing. It's just saying that we access the opponent's offense, so that's another reason there's an offense differential. But if you have time, the best situation you can be is to have a way of controlling an opponent offense and have an aspect of weighing for probability, magnitude, and time frame. Now, as I'll talk about in my video, there are other components and other mechanisms of weighing, but I just think these are like such standard and do a good job of covering that if you have one for all of them, then you're going to be in a good spot. And again, you do not need to do this, right? There are times where you won't have time. There are times where maybe you objectively do not outweigh on magnitude, but the ideal situation for you to be after the summary is for you to have all of this. The very final thing that I want to talk about in this video is weighing mechanisms and framework. And the only reason I'm talking about this is because if I didn't, people are going to be like, well, this isn't actually the most in-depth summary video because you never talked about weighing mechanisms and framework. Okay? A quick note here is that framing or weighing mechanisms is different than framework. Framing is a question of how impacts compare to other impacts. Framework is a rules or style question regarding which impacts should factor into the decision, right? It is framing for me to say prefer econ impacts. It is framework for me to say that you can only evaluate the audit implications of a policy option, okay? That's the difference. The distinction isn't particularly relevant for the rest of this video because you're going to treat them the same when you're organizing the summary, right? It doesn't mean they function the same, just that the advice I'm going to give in this video will be the same either way. And I will say, there's not much to put here, okay? You cover the weighing mechanism or the framework at the top of the summary, but after the thesis. And if you are including framing, then you should modify your thesis to integrate this framing, right? The framing is going to help you establish why your offense justifies the ballot. So for example, your thesis might be something like, voting affirmative magnifies income inequality, the resulting structural violence should always be prioritized over vague promises of trickle-down economics, okay? Now you're saying, like, here's our offense, and there is an offense differential because you should always prioritize structural violence. That is how the thesis is integrating the framing. Right? So cover the weighing mechanism or framework at the top of the summary, but after the thesis. Next thing to talk about is there is a strategic choice here, okay? If you have a weighing mechanism and you are going all in on framed impacts in the summary, then you should spend 0 time on standard weighing. 100% of the weighing analysis should go at the top, immediately after the weighing mechanism is mentioned, right? And this is pretty obvious, okay? If you're going all in on framed impacts, then the only relevant weighing is going to be the framing. You do not need to stand up and make additional arguments regarding magnitude and time frame and probability, because everything that is relevant, if you are going all in on framed impacts, already needs to be mentioned in the weighing mechanism. So you should shift all of your framing up to the weighing mechanism section if you are going all in on framed impacts that early. If, on the other hand, you are going for a weighing mechanism, but you also want to keep standard impact framing as a viable execution in the final focus, then you should spend time on the weighing mechanism, but you also need to include standard weighing after each voter. So you would include the framing, like here is why you should prefer structural violence impacts, but then later on you're also going to want to make arguments regarding time frame, probability, magnitude. Just don't repeat, right? If the weighing mechanism is time frame, probability, magnitude, etc., then you don't need to repeat that. Just, I think you should separate them if you are trying to keep standard and framed impacts as separate options for the final focus. Last thing, very last thing in this video is how much time should you spend on the weighing mechanism or the framing? And this is probably the most important question on this weighing mechanism section. And the answer is, I'm not even going to attempt to give you a number in response, right? Now, I will say weighing mechanisms and framing are just preemptive weighing, right? That's all they are. If you're giving a weighing mechanism that says structural violence is the most important impact, that is no different than weighing your structural violence impact after it happens. Absolutely no different. Okay, so that's just preemptive weighing, which means the exact same rule applies as when should you weigh, right? You should weigh after you have established access to the line of offense. So prioritize access, and then remaining time can be spent on the weighing mechanism. Any remaining time you spend on the weighing mechanism, but this sort of rule is a little bit trickier because the weighing mechanism needs to go first, right? So you need to be very, very aware, very cognizant of how much time am I going to need to spend establishing access, because the weighing mechanism goes first. The other situation is if you're reading framework, right? Framework is not preemptive weighing. If you're saying that you should only evaluate fiated implications, then you're not just saying like, oh, we're controlling links to the opponent's case, it's also the foundational purpose of something, right? There's a different rule that applies, and I'm going to cover that in a later video on framework, but just because I want this to be an in-depth video, I'll talk about it real briefly, okay? If you are going for some sort of style or rules question framework, then you need to spend as much time on the framework section as you need to make your collapse viable, okay? So if you are going for no fiated impacts, and you don't have a lot of good, like, actual case answers on the opponents, you're going to need to spend a ton of time on your framework. You're going to need to work on the framework until you feel comfortable moving on to your lines of offense, okay? If you feel like there is a chance that on framework you're going to lose and the opponents are going to access all of their fiated impacts, then you should probably spend more time on framework. You didn't do a sufficient job. The other thing to note about framework instead of framing is that you can spend more time on framework if it replaces case defense, right? If your framework, hypothetically, excludes all impacts stemming from fiat, then you get to replace all of your case defense, right? There's no need for you to make case defense in the summary if you are going all in on framework that says no fiated implications. You do not get hypothetical implementation in this round. So that's the second rule, spend more time on framework if it replaces case defense, okay? Weighing mechanisms do not have this rule because weighing mechanisms do not replace defense. Weighing mechanisms, again, are preemptive weighing. I mean, I guess in a way, like I mentioned earlier, weighing defense is a form of weighing, but weighing mechanisms cannot replace defense on the opponent's case because all it really is just preemptive weighing, and preemptive weighing does not replace defense. Like I said in the what is good access, or what is setting up the partner in the final focus way earlier in the video, is that you need good defense against the opponent's case. And here's sort of the more specific reason why that is true, right? If you go all in on your weighing mechanism and you do not have any link defense on the opponent's case, right, then the opponents have uncontested link access. And like I said earlier, if the opponents have uncontested link access, they can very easily win the round because they get to spend all of the time doing weighing. And because you do not have uncontested link access, you do not get to spend all of the time weighing, which means they're going to be able to outtime you on weighing. And unless you're way, way better than them, you're just going to lose by default like that, okay? So weighing mechanisms cannot replace defense, but framework can replace defense. That is all I have for this video. It was almost 2 hours long. I hope it is helpful. I hope it covered everything that you need. Let me know if you have any other questions.